Hello and welcome back to this Downplayalistic Crusade. This will be a review of Kino Lorber's release of the really important, very underrated, mostly overlooked Universal horror film, even though it's more of a mystery thriller. It is technically a Universal horror film. And of course, this 1933's The Secret of the Blue Room, which is actually a remake of a German film, and a film that Universal seemed very happy with, so they would later remake it themselves at least 2 more times. Not to mention really recycle elements into other films. This is right there in the opening sort of fanfare early days of the golden age of horror at Universal. It was made in 1933 and even opens with Swan Lake, and I don't know what greater qualification a film could have as being a classic Universal horror film than opening with Swan Lake, exactly like Dracula and The Mummy, for example. So this, again, it is not really a horror film, and it definitely is a early form of a lot of the locked room sort of mystery cliche stories. So when you see this for the first time, a lot of it will feel very, very familiar. It's also just, shortly over an hour, so the runtime is very brisk, but it's like all the other non-horror, quote-unquote Universal monster films, because it's always how they classify them. It hasn't had the greatest history on home video. It's been very obscure, and people only saw it because of television airings, and then eventually the other film that got subsequently released by Kino, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, which is also not really a horror film, but is in the Universal horror canon. It didn't really get many releases, if any, so the only decent, more modern release of either film was in Universal's MOD archive series. So it was a really great sign to see them get a Blu-ray upgrade. Again, Kino put these out late last year in 2021. They are from newer HD masters and scans, or at least HD upgrades of what turned up on the archive DVDs. Now, Secret of the Blue Room, again, it's not really a horror film. It is very much a locked room mystery, because there literally is a locked room where people have died mysteriously in the past before, and it's sort of everybody gets around in the room, and you have 3 suitors who are all out after the affections of the heroine played by Gloria Stewart. So again, you have a key player of classic Universal horror, and they each decide to spend a night in the locked Blue Room where people had died under mysterious circumstances many years before. And of course, it's a spooky old mansion filled with all kinds of eccentric characters and a mysterious butler. And, when the house is owned by Lionel Atwill, you kind of know what you're in for. So, of course, we have another main standby of classic horror in Atwill, and he plays the father of the Gloria Stewart character. You'll also recognize quite a bit of the actual set. It should seem very familiar. This film was produced very inexpensively, and that was because it was mostly reusing old sets. And by old, I mean it's literally the set from the old Dark House, but much brighter, and things are changed up just a little bit. But if you don't have to look very closely to recognize the staircase and the landing and the main sort of hall, and then especially the long corridor with the windows and the blowing curtains. Even some of the sound effects of the old Dark House make a reappearance, particularly the thunder and the wind of the storm outside on a stormy night. The film is very simple in its story because there's not a lot of runtime to play with, and again, this is a remake of a film that had already existed that Universal just bought the rights to. Now, the plot is very simple, as I alluded to already. You have the old dark mansion, everyone's sitting around, and the Atwill character recounting the story of the Blue Room and how people mysteriously died there. Then the 3 suitors, after the Gloria Stewart character, decide, after the youngest proposes this, to each spend the night in the Blue Room to prove their worthiness or their bravery. Then, of course, people start disappearing or mysteriously dying in said Blue Room, and no one can figure out why, because the door is locked and they seem to have disappeared or died in exactly the same manner as had happened many years before, according to the actual story. So the rest of the film involves trying to figure out the actual mystery, and the sort of charge is led by the main suitor, played by Paul Lucas. This goes along for a little bit until about halfway through the running time, the police arrive and are led by the inspector played by Edward Arnold, who basically does the classic element of getting everybody into a room and starting to question everyone and poke holes in their alibis and their stories. And there are, of course, a number of red herrings and various characters in different forms, and all this stuff became commonplace in terms of this type of story, and really kind of already was, because when you see this film, you're going to think of every other sort of locked room mystery you've ever seen or heard of, and you can really draw the line at least back to Universal's The Cat and the Canary, which they had already made with the silent classic directed by Paul Linney, and then of course it would later be reinvented as the Bob Hope vehicle. But that the Cat and the Canary is basically, I think, the sort of gold standard for this type of story. Unfortunately, this film, Secret of the Blue Room, doesn't really have the humor or the wit of Paul Linney or Cat and the Canary, nor does it have the wit of James Whale, and that becomes very obvious when you recognize the sets as being from the old Dark House. You kind of wish a lot of times you were watching that movie instead, because even though it has a short runtime, the film is rather dry. It's still enjoyable, and it's a fascinating artifact from this period of the early days of Universal horror, and it's still a relatively early talkie, and it's still within the pre-code era. But it doesn't really ever seem to do anything all that special, and if you go into it like most people looking for a horror film, you're going to come away disappointed. It's much more in sort of like a gothic tradition, if you will, and I think a number of the Universal horrors without the monster characters could be more considered a gothic, especially Mystery of Edwin Drood. It's totally a gothic. It's a Dickens adaptation, of course, but this one, it is a classic in the locked room mystery genre, and this is thankfully at least before all of the elements of the locked room mystery became a tried and true cliche and so worn out that if you're going to do them or use them at all, it has to be in a sort of self-referential, almost slightly mocking way. And if you do any of that stuff now, the first thing that people will say, or the first thing out of their mouths, is the that it has a Scooby-Doo quality, which of course it does, but of course this is where that sort of form originated. So it's a fun film to come back to, but it's not. I don't think it's exceptionally strong. I think it's much more notable for its time placement in terms of the Universal horror canon being so early on, and then having some of the really famous faces from the early days of horror, particularly Lionel Atwill, who is of course great in everything, but he takes he has a sort of he is one of the possible villains of the piece, but he's very subdued here. You don't get the sort of energy or fun or charm of his other pre-code horror classics. Particularly, you'll be thinking of Dr. X quite a lot, because that eventually becomes a sort of locked room mystery with all the various characters locked away in a spooky old mansion and trying to determine who the killer is. But that film has just bristling energy, because of course it was directed by Michael Curtiz and is one of the most grisly and wonderfully lurid of all pre-code horror films. If you go into this because it has Lionel Atwill thinking it's going to have anything like Dr. X, you're sorely mistaken, and you will wish that it had some of that energy. So again, some people really love this film. I enjoy it, and I'm really pleased we now have a Blu-ray version of it, because it's been painfully obscure, and it is a very important part of the Universal horror canon. But I do think it's a more minor film. I think it's more notable for its placement, coming out in 1933, being made back-to-back with the other films. And it does inherently have a little bit of that sort of hand-me-down feel, because they made it for like a very low sum. I think it's around $67,000, somewhere around there, on a very short schedule, and again reusing sets from the old Dark House and other things. So there is that sort of inherent, again, hand-me-down quality. Again, it may be more of just my own personal take on it, but I do think it is a more minor film in the Universal horror canon. But I do think it has great atmosphere, and because it is made when the Limleys were still in charge of the studio, it is still part of the golden age of Universal horror, and it has more sort of class and style than what you're going to get in the sort of Silver Age in the 1940s, where again they would remake this film twice in different ways. I haven't seen those, but I've read about them, and I really would like to see them. Of course, the third version actually made it into more of a musical, so they took it in different directions. And also, I think it didn't help that this was already a remake of a film, and this story has been made at least 4 or 5 times. It also actually uses footage of the original foreign version in the film, which is why those exterior shots really stick out, because they are of a completely different quality. They've basically just been, they are dupe sections, literally copied from the original version Universal bought to do the remake, and then just slot it in. So that's that kind of shameless using footage of the film you're remaking. But it's not a bad film. I don't want to come out sounding too harsh on it, but don't go into it expecting it to be a quote unquote universal horror film. It is, the way it's sold is a bit misleading, but it is a universal horror title. It should be considered with the rest of them, and it's of course a shame they have never done a complete universal horror set or set of releases that include all of the quote-unquote non-monster films and the films that would be technically more of gothic horrors or just plain gothic stories or murder mysteries like Secret of the Blue Room. They are part of the horror canon, and they should be treated as such and properly restored with the others. And it's just it's great that we're finally getting HD releases of these films, but they're sort of trickling out from all kinds of different places, and some have received better treatment than others, unfortunately. So now we come to the Kino Lorber Blu-ray, which is from a Universal master. Some have claimed it's a 2K master or a new 2K master. There's nothing on the packaging, but I would guess it's something like that, or it was a master they perhaps made for the old archive DVD, but I'm not entirely sure, because I've never owned that disc, but I did read that it was interlaced and had a lot of issues and was not very good looking. So I figured it was based on some old standard def video master. Here we have a brand new scan of some element. It has not been meticulously restored, and actually to call it restored is not really accurate either. It is a rather rough transfer in spots. You can tell right from the opening Universal logo with lines running right through it. You're going to notice quite a bit of damage. It thankfully clears up over the course of the film. By the halfway point, it's much better. It seems most of the inherent source issues are confined more towards the first half of the film. So in the picture, you're going to notice everything from lines and scratches and bits of dust and some definite frame wobble, and there's just stuff going on all over the place. This has not been restored in the way that the more famous titles have, and it is definitely stuff baked into the source element they're working with. In terms of quality, it's far better than anything we've had before, because again, all we had was, I believe, VHS and then the old archive MOD DVD from a number of years ago, which had a lot of problems of its own. So it is, still a quantum leap ahead of those, but it's not really been cleaned up. It does have a lot of issues baked in, so don't go into this thinking it's going to be nice and pristine like a modern Universal scan or 2K or 4K restoration, because it simply isn't. Another thing is, you'll definitely notice when there's footage duped in from the original version, which is really just about the first thing you see in the film after the titles. You see the exterior shot, and they look really ropey, and if you've never seen the film before, you're going to wonder why they look so bad, and that is simply because they have been copied in from the original foreign version. So that's why they have a much lower quality and don't look very good at all. So it definitely, it's a shame this hasn't been fully restored. It should be as a Universal horror classic. I think it's kind of crazy it's taking Universal this long to actually start working on the horror titles, and not just the main ones. However, on the other hand, it may be sort of a blessing that it hasn't been worked on in the same way, because The bigger titles until more recently have had a lot of problems Universal restorations and disc releases have had in the past, where they're a bit too over cleaned up or over manipulated. Thankfully, Universal doesn't go crazy with the DNR button anymore, but the big main horror titles have never looked as good as I really think they could from an archival standpoint. The newer 4K releases do seem to be correcting a lot of that because they are improvements over the Blu-rays, but they're only doing select titles. So this is very much a sort of warts and all presentation, which I do appreciate, but I do think it should be stressed for people going into this or fans of this film to not expect a full, restored, pristine master because it simply isn't. This is a title where this is more, I guess, of a protection element they scanned, maybe did a little bit of cleanup work on it here and there just to get it ready for a disc master, but outside of that, it does have a number of issues baked in. Now, on the audio front, again, this is a early talkie still in the pre-code era. It does have a number of issues just like the picture does in terms of age-related wear and source wear that hasn't been messed with. But on the other hand, as I alluded to before, that's kind of a good thing because Universal has a track record of being way too overzealous in their cleanup of the horror films. I still don't like what they did to Dracula and removing all of the source hiss, which is a very important part of that film, and also meant that they removed a bit of audio information, just as they had done on Frankenstein in the past. So it's good in some ways that they didn't go to town on this track, but it is also extremely noisy. It's also got several points where either it's in the source or there may have been some attempts at cleaning some really bad spots, because there are some points where the audio seems to almost fade out to a very, very low level or go quiet. Again, that may just be part of the source, but it also may be an attempt to really cover up some bad damage or something. So the audio is not really that great either, unfortunately. But a lot of that is because of the source that we're dealing with, which I assume has got to be some sort of secondary source. I don't believe this was a negative scan. Had it been, it would have been 2K or 4K at least, and would have been restored, I would think, with the more modern Universal archival standards. So I think they seem to have done the best with what they had available, but the audio presentation does have a number of issues. You're going to hear distortion in the music cues when they do appear, particularly when they get loud and strident. As with most early talkies, you're going to get a lot of distortion in the higher end. There is quite a bit of hiss. There are pops and ticks all over the place throughout the feature. This has not been, again, like the picture, it has not been restored in the way that people have come to expect. So don't go into this release thinking it's going to be a fully restored, pristine master. Again, I want to stress that. But for this film and the presentations it's gotten before, this is still, I think, the best release the film has ever gotten. It's just a shame it wasn't decided to give the film the royal treatment as part of the Universal horror canon. That being said, I do think the audio sounds pretty much about as good as it can, and again, it seems that a lot of the stuff is baked into the source for both picture and sound. Now, in terms of the packaging, very nicely, Kino has reproduced one of the original posters for the film, which looks really nice. So this is usually better than what you'd get on a Universal release. They do a box set and not always use original art, so that's rather nice. It is surprising to see Universal Horrors get a boutique label release outside of a box set. It was nice for Kino to get these as part of their Universal deal. It's in the standard Kino design jacket, and of course with the standard plain Kino label. Now, in terms of extras, there is a trailer gallery of other Kino-related releases, or releases they find are related. The main draw is a new audio commentary by Michael Schlesinger. It's a good track, and it is actually, I think, very difficult to cover films that are very short. in terms of recording a commentary, because you have so little time to go on, you have to then try to cover everything else in terms of plot and biographical information. So he does a good job at talking about the film and some of the other versions and why this was remade and how it was produced at a much lower cost by reusing sets. And it doesn't, it isn't the greatest film in the world, but because of the era in which it was made in 1933 as part of the original PreCode golden age of Universal horror, that it has a good, some staying power to it, even if the plot elements are very cliched and very stodgy when viewed now. So it's a good track. It covers a lot of great ground. I'd say probably my biggest complaint, though, is it threw me at first. But when you listen to this, it sounds like, as with most people recording commentaries, you've got to at least probably have some notes you're going off of. It doesn't ever sound like he's reading a prepared essay, which some commentators do, which is fine, if that works for you. But it does. I swear I picked up what sounded like him scratching out on a notepad when he hits certain talking points. It happened at least 2 or 3 times, and at first I thought it was something in the track or some audio defect in the film I had missed, because it sounded distinctly like a pencil marking out notes, and then I realized, I think the microphone is picking up him scribbling out when he's covered a talking point. So that was a little amusing, but that's something I hadn't encountered in a commentary before. But again, it's kind of fun sometimes. Sometimes things like that happen, and microphones pick up you scribbling out your talking points. But yeah, it's a solid commentary, and it's a good reason why you might want to upgrade to this release outside of it being a new HD transfer, even though it isn't restored. And I do think he covers a lot of good ground, and it is a very solid commentary, which is one of it's really. Kino has done a good job at getting more and more commentaries. Not all of them, unfortunately, are worth your time. But when they're good like this, it's an extra inducement to pick up a release that might otherwise look to be rather bare bones or be a very specialty title, this being a 66-minute PreCode horror film from Universal that really isn't a horror film. So that's my thoughts on Kino's release of the 1933 Universal horror classic Secret of the Blue Room. It is one of the most overlooked titles in the Universal horror canon. It is one of these select special titles that's a Universal horror film that's not really a horror film. So that means it's gotten sort of shuffled to the side, and it's really been overlooked and not well represented throughout time, especially on home video. So it was a great surprise and a great treat to get this along with Edwin Drood as a Blu-ray release from Kino Lorber. Also surprising that it wasn't picked up by Shout Factory and done in their Universal Horror collections, which they've now done 6 volumes. So I would heartily recommend this to any fan of classic horror, and it's an absolutely essential film for Universal Horror fans. No Universal Horror collection is complete without it, and we now finally have at least a better presentation on Blu-ray. I do wish it had been fully restored. I do think it deserves to be. I really do think there should be a Universal Horror Canon box set. I think that should have happened years ago. I think probably the closest we ever got to that in terms of Universal doing as many titles as possible was during the VHS era, when they had the Classic Monster Collection series, and they started doing more of the sequels and more of the lesser known films and films like this. So it's great that they're finally licensing these titles out to boutique labels who are at least getting these out on disc with at least newer scans, even in a case like this where it's not fully restored. It's rescuing a film from the realms of random TV airings, VHS tapes, and MOD DVDs of not very good masters. So this is still an essential upgrade, even though the quality is not what I wish it would be at. It's still surprisingly good. And it was interesting to come back to this film after a long time, because I hadn't seen it in a while. And I usually only think about it when I'm thinking about the history of Universal Horror, or I'm reading the chapter on it in the essential book Universal Horrors. So I think it makes for essential Halloween or October viewing. It's a great locked room mystery classic of the genre for fans of classic mysteries, and I do think it's an essential disc from Kino Lorber, because there's very little chance of this ever getting, I think, the 2K or 4K restoration it deserves, and for the time being, this is the best quality we've ever had for the film on disc or home video at all, and I think it's really miraculous we've even gotten it on Blu-ray. So I do wholeheartedly recommend the Kino Lorber release with the nice commentary as well, and it's very inexpensive on their website and frequently turns up in their sales. So I do think it is an essential disc for your annual Universal horror viewings. As always, I hope my never-ending babblings on classic films have been at least somewhat fun and informative. Do keep supporting boutique labels and studio labels by buying discs and to keep physical media alive. And as always, thanks ever so much for watching.